Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Ryan Tillman Show. It is my privilege today to do an interview that I think is so necessary because a lot of times when these situations happen involving law enforcement in the community, you only get one side of the story. I talk about it all the time. You only get the media side or social media side, but you don't really get to hear from the sheriff or the police officers themselves. So I've talked to many police officers before. I've talked to sheriff deputies before, but there is nothing more valuable than being able to talk to the head sheriff or the head chief in charge and actually get to hear some transparency from their lips. And so today with us, I actually have Sheriff Dicus from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. Thanks again, Sheriff, for being with us and allowing me to interview you and talk about some of the major issues that are going on.
No, Ryan, I'm actually honored to be here. I know you do the job also, and I think it's good to have that perspective and actually be asked questions by somebody that has that perspective. I think that's very important.
What's so interesting about this is so I just look at how things transpire. So I was a graduate from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Academy, a class of 192 with the Chino Police Department, and I would have never imagined, all those years ago, it was at 2013, that I'd be doing what I'm doing now and the value that I hope to bring to the police department in the sense of being able to share transparency. Like, the reason I got into law enforcement was because I needed a job. But then once I got into it, I understood that there was a true need for bridging that gap between law enforcement and the community. And so it's just an honor to be here, especially, coming from being a product of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, which, by the way, you guys still have one of the only, I don't want to say one of the only, but you guys still have a pretty stressful academy. Is that correct?
Yeah, we still use stress training, put people in situations, yell at them, get in their face. Make sure they feel comfortable operating when they leave the academy with the things they'll actually face on the street. Hey, and the part about the community and what you're dedicated to, because I've seen it, breaking barriers and a number of things you've done. Believe it or not, what I see as being the sheriff, because the sheriff is an elected person by the citizens, I speak their voice and I take that seriously. And so when we see social trends, because as cops we meet them in the street, I think it's very important that I share with you and I share with the rest of the public, what a law enforcement officer sees in the street, because they need to understand we're doing things that most civilized people don't want to do.
Yes.
And that we should be supported in doing that. So it's always, for a sheriff, a foot in both camps, making sure you're representing the public that expects to be policed in a certain manner, a fair and equitable manner, and at the same time you're representing those people doing the job.
So spot on with that. And I want you guys to know, if you guys are listening to this at home or watching this at home, this is not a political podcast at all. And I want people to get that through their head, because sometimes people will think, anytime a sheriff or a chief wants to address people or the public about certain issues, they're like, oh, he's just doing that because it's political. But I've known Sheriff Dicus for some time now. You've known me since the very beginning of the start of BBU, and you've always supported me, you and a lot of your colleagues around the area. So I know Sheriff Dicus personally. So that's what makes it even more, that's what makes me appreciate this even more, because I know that your heart, I know that you care, where there are some leaders across our country that will get up on stage just for the sake of checking a box, but you can see right through it. And I don't believe that's you. And so before we get to some of the issues, I do want to go back to talking about the Stress Academy, because I think this is something that the general public doesn't understand. And I think in law enforcement, we are kind of being detrimental to ourselves in a sense of why stress academies are so important. I know there's some agencies that are going away from stress academies. But if you look at our profession as a whole, and I learned this when I got into the field and thrust into, critical incidents, those are moments that you cannot run away from. And I remember when I first got in the academy, I think we started with 68 people. And we got down, I think we ended up graduating 42.
Sure.
And within the first week or so, we had 5, 6, 7 people quit. So can you talk to me about why you believe the stress is so important to expose people to stress in the academy? Because I feel like we live in this age nowadays where it's like, oh, if we're too hard on you, we don't want to be too hard on you. But in our profession, there is a level where we have to train you to be tough. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I think it goes down to a core value, even the oath we take, right, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, what does the enemy look like? How does it present itself? Exactly how do you deal with it? And you said it, you can't run away. So where you want to identify somebody that may have trouble in dealing with those tough situations is in a training environment. So if you introduce them to stress, people learn how to cope with stress, you know that you can think through those things. A lot of times they call it tunnel vision, where when people are yelling at you, you get the tunnel vision, you don't know what to do, and it's fight or flight, and you don't always make the best decisions. The more we're able to get a candidate in the academy used to that stressful situation, the higher likelihood they're going to be able to think through it and make the good decisions that the public expects us to make, whether it's using force, whether it's being able to de-escalate, all of those things. And you can only do it by presenting that environment. So we try to create it in the academy and make sure people are trained for what they're going to actually see in real life, and probably worse.
Yeah. You do a phenomenal job at doing it, and it's I always say it's the best fun I never want to have again.
Absolutely.
But I realized so many lessons that even to this day, I mean, you're talking about 12, 13 years removed from the academy. Even in my own personal daily life, there's lessons that I learned there. I'll never forget, one of the days when we were in the academy, we were all sitting in class, and we just heard this loud music coming from the grinder. And we were like, where's that music coming from the grinder? And my friend Ozzy, we called him Ozzy, his Toyota Celica was literally sitting in the quad with all the papers and everything. Turned out the music was blasting. And what happened was he left his car unlocked, and the whole point of it was like, when you're a law enforcement officer, you have guns and things in your car, you have to keep your stuff secure, but it's little lessons like that that will make you never forget again. And so I think that's so important for the community to know how we train, because we want the community to know, like, we do dot all our I's and we try to cross all of our T's. Are we going to be perfect? Absolutely not. But you guys have done a phenomenal job doing that, and I want to give credit to you guys for wanting if you ask me, one of the best academies across the country.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know when I get a chance to talk to those students, I still try when I can and go out and run the alumni run, which happens the day before their graduation, and we have an opportunity to talk to the academy students before their big night. And when I get a chance to talk to them, I always tell them, remember the people wearing the red shirts or their academy instructors, because I can promise them that whether it's 30 days after they get out of the academy or 30 years, something they will have learned from those people will save their life. And it's that exact same example. I mean, or maybe save somebody else's life because somebody didn't get a gun or something along those lines. And I couldn't be more proud of what we've got going on there. We do produce a lot of great graduates. And I think it's funny, especially you being from a police department. One thing I'd like all of your listeners to know is that the chiefs of police and I, we're like this in this county. It doesn't matter. Nobody considers themselves the big dog or the little dog. We all unite to take care of the community. And I think that's something brilliant about San Bernardino County, is that we have those relationships.
I've seen that firsthand. You guys have a great relationship with each other. Like I said, I work for the Chino Police Department, and I know our chiefs that have gone through the years, they've always had a good relationship with the county. So it's awesome to see firsthand. And it also trickles down. I mean, you can see the way county officer or county deputies work with police officers, and I can't say the same for every other agency across the country. And I do a lot of evaluations, so I think what we have here in the San Bernardino County, and I would say in Riverside County too,
absolutely,
pretty unique compared to the rest of the country. So what I want to do now is I want to get into some specific things. Okay. Now, I could sit here all day and talk about why you became a sheriff and all the good stuff, and all that stuff is equally valuable. But the reason I want to actually talk more about these next topics is because this is what the rest of the world is wondering. You guys have had some pretty critical incidents within the last several years. You've had some recently in regards to Ryan Gaynor, which we'll get into in a minute, who is an autistic boy that was killed by deputies. But then you also, about 2 years ago, I want to say in September of 2022, you had a situation that evolved where a dad had kidnapped his daughter. Crazy pursuit happens. And then ultimately, not only is the suspect killed, but the daughter is also killed during the firefight that happens. You guys released the body cam footage. You guys released a critical incident report, and there was a lot of questions behind it. And so I actually did a evaluation of it. And talking to you before we even started, it seemed like my evaluation was pretty spot on with what happened. But let's start with that incident, and then I want to work our way to the big thing, which is mental health, because I think there's a lot of conceptions about mental health. But I do want to start with the situation that occurred in September 2022, where I remember I was working, and I remember there was a bolo that was put out for a man that had kidnapped his daughter, and he had just murdered, I believe, his wife.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct. It happened in Fontana, and actually the daughter, along with her father, witnessed her mother being murdered.
Oh, wow.
And then an Amber Alert went out because initially we weren't sure what the situation is between the daughter and the father. Was she kidnapped against her will? Those types of things. So an Amber Alert went out. And then correspondingly, that's how we get involved in the case a day later in terms of a pursuit. Wow.
So then, okay, like a day later, you have a deputy, or you guys get a call from a convenience store because somebody sees the girl that they recognize,
You're exactly
if I'm not
right.
mistaken.
Yes.
And then you have deputies respond, and they basically identify the vehicle, and then that's when the pursuit starts.
Absolutely.
So during that pursuit, what kind of transpires next?
So we actually have one of our sergeants that sees the vehicle. He's trying to respond to that convenience store where the caller was at, intercepts them on the highway, and it happens to be close to the intersection out there in the Lenwood area of Barstow. And they end up getting on the freeway and heading southbound, in other words, back down here towards San Bernardino. Before they get on the freeway, speeds start to elevate. The sergeant tries to make a traffic stop, and almost immediately as that exchange between the roadway and the freeway happens, there is a shooting that occurs where they're shooting, the occupants of the vehicle are shooting back at our deputies. Matter of fact, one of our deputies gets involved, and his unit actually gets disabled as a result of that shooting. The sergeant has to make the decision, not knowing if the deputy's hurt or not, to stop very quickly, check on the deputy, and then engage back in the pursuit.
Wow, talk about a difficult decision, because you have your partner here, got to check on your partner, but then you still also have them that are a danger to the public. And that also ups the stakes, if you ask me, ups the antes. Now you know you're in a pursuit where they're shooting at me. And I would imagine the deputy wasn't sure how many people were in the car at that time, who was armed in that car. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, we knew that Samantha Graziano was seen at the convenience store, but as far as knowing who's who, I mean, it's like any call you get. You may think you know what's going on, but until you actually make the traffic stop and identify people, do you know who's involved? Gotcha.
So if it's my understanding, the pursuit continues, you got multiple units, you guys even request for CHP to come out there with a charger because the guy was going at crazy speeds, and they also, and I know it's also common for us, like the CHP, California Highway Patrol, when they're on highways, this is their expert level field, like a training, like they operate on these highways. So sometimes, in this case, it's important to probably get them involved if you see necessary, just because they know the highways and stuff like that. Is correct?
Oh no, that's absolutely correct. And they also have a radio system that works statewide, where our restrictions are generally to the county and the repeater systems and things like that. So getting them involved, in the first aircraft that was able to assist us was what we call H-80 and the CHP helicopter. So really what transpires after that is 40 miles of the pursuit with intermittent shooting from the car that was in front of us, not at just us, but randomly shooting that could affect the citizens on the freeway and a number of things. And that pursuit carries itself all the way from Barstow for about 40 miles into the city of Hesperia.
And you have witnesses that say they saw somebody shooting from the passenger side of the vehicle. And then if you go to case law, I believe it's Graham versus Connor that talks about if a person is an immediate threat to the public, not just officers, but the public, the officers have to talk about utilizing some reasonable force in order to stop that threat. And so you have a lot of things culminating at one time. Now, the reason why I think this is so controversial, and the reason I'm bringing it up, is because the young girl, she's 15 years old, and it's determined later that she's ultimately killed by deputies. Now, the way the media put it out, well, I want you to tell me how the media put it out and why this became controversial.
So right now, the Department of Justice is still looking at this, but I'll be able to talk to it in a manner where they still have to evaluate,
okay, cool.
And they're looking at the legal aspects of this to determine. And what most people don't know is probably a good thing for us to explain right now is anytime you're involved in an officer-involved shooting, we treat it just like a homicide.
Correct.
It goes to the body, whether it's the DA or the DOJ in this case, and they look at it to determine whether or not it was a justifiable homicide. And so that's really the basis of these types of things that go on.
Okay.
In this case, when the pursuit stops, we've got 3 different locations about where deputies stop in this pursuit trying to contain it, because usually what we try to do anytime there's violence, you don't want to let it continue, like going down the freeway. We had a chance, because the suspect exited the roadway, to contain this. So I've got people stopped on top of a bridge, other people stopped onto what is the on-ramp to the freeway, even though the suspect went the opposite direction. And then I've got people down on the freeway. So think of it like a triangle, but with different elevations. So what happens is sometime during that pursuit, the active firefight continues. It's continued from the pursuit. The active firefight continues there. The vehicle tries to access Main Street by going up a very steep hill, doesn't access it, rolls backwards, and comes back to where the deputies had stopped along the freeway. So really what we've got to do at this point is still continue to try to contain it. It's still an active firefight. We have 3 different perspectives. And in a lot of things that the media couches this is just, hey, we randomly killed an unarmed teenager. And there were a number of circumstances that led the deputies to believe that that teenager was the suspect. And this is what DOJ is challenged with. And my point, and we also had to release the video and audio and evidence that goes along with that. There are certain requirements in the law that we have timeframes we have to do that, and which we just recently did. So what this leaves the media with is them trying to understand what's going on, but not understanding maybe criminal law, Graham versus Connor you mentioned, and just use of force as a whole.
General, correct.
So what it looks like to them is that, hey, this was a random killing of a teenager. What DOJ is charged with is really looking at what the constitutional standard is, and would a reasonable officer that it was any one of these different varying points would have done the same thing that the officers did on that day. And that's what I don't think the media does a good job of explaining to the public, that how do you bring a serious crisis like that to a close without violence.
Correct.
And going through those steps to try to prevent it. And then also understanding the nuances of a crisis like that, and the fact that you're still involved in a live firefight, and these things happen within seconds.
Yes.
Seconds. And you don't have time to make a lot of calculated decisions or anything else. You're doing the best you can to contain a problem. And that's what DOJ is looking at now.
What's so interesting about this conversation is we talk about the reasonable officer. Now, I did a breakdown of this. I actually don't even know if I released it yet. But as I did the breakdown of it, I'm a reasonable officer, was on patrol, probably spent about 6 or 7 years on patrol, did some special assignments, been involved in some critical incidents. So I would be what's classified as a reasonable officer with a certain level of training. And as I'm breaking this and evaluating the situation, the critical incident debrief that you released, the conclusion I came to was, because the question is how do officers shoot this young 15-year-old girl? That's the question. And as I'm looking at this, there's a lot of different factors that play into it. Number one is they know they're dealing with somebody who's violent, because the guy has already demonstrated he killed his wife with his daughter present. Number two is that as they go to contact him, they're now being confronted with gunfire. So now that, like I said, ups the stakes. Then you also have witnesses that see, like, hey, there's somebody shooting from the driver's side. It's not just, or from the passenger side, not just the driver, but the passenger side, which, we'd have to, deductive reasoning would tell us that it was the daughter, if you ask me, just reasonable, if I'm just thinking about this from a common sense perspective. Then you continue, and now, like you talk about the different elevation changes. So the conclusion that I was able to come to from a reasonable perspective was, you can see at the very end of this pursuit, when the car stalls out, one of the deputies is saying, "Come to me, come to me." And as he's saying, "Come to me," the officers are still firing. But what people don't realize is that you had other deputies that are on the other side of the freeway that are elevated, and all they see is a girl come out with a ballistic helmet on, a vest or some type of vest on, and walking towards their partners after they already know that the people from this vehicle have been shooting. So what people don't understand is that I shoot a lot, I go to the range. Gunfire is very loud. And you add gunfire to the equation, you add a lot of adrenaline into the equation, you add having the ability to think quickly. I mean, it's a very, very difficult thing for those deputies not to know that she's not a threat. And it would appear to me the only person that knew that she was not a threat is the person that was calling her to them. So is there things that, looking back in retrospect, we do this all the time in law enforcement, could we do things differently? Yeah, obviously, but if we look at it, hindsight being 20/20, you put a reasonable person in those shoes, would they have made a similar decision? And if you ask me, they would have. Now, am I off in saying my conclusion, my personal conclusion, is based on a reasonable person?
No, and I think that's really what DOJ is tasked with. And I keep mentioning DOJ, and for those listening, they might say, well, why are you talking about DOJ, and why is this not, the DA's office?
Correct.
Right at the time the shooting had occurred, there was an assembly bill called Assembly Bill 1506 that involves if a person was unarmed in a law enforcement shooting. And that doesn't mean that the law enforcement officers did anything wrong. It's just that reasonable standard is one of the standards that the folks evaluating the case have to look at it in. At the time, this had become the law. So even though we think there's a high likelihood that she was the shooter, and let me qualify this for the audience that's listening to us
please.
too. That child was not the problem here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
She is a victim.
100%.
100% a victim. Her father was the problem
100%.
and put her into the situation. And I don't think, a lot of people are trying to look at it like the police are vilifying the child. That is not the case.
Mm-hmm.
We know exactly who is at fault for this.
Correct.
But at the same time, it is that viewpoint that you're looking at. And 1506 basically says, hey, at the time of the shooting, if she wasn't armed, I needed to call DOJ. Well, you can imagine in some of these cases with it being new, you don't know if she's armed. You can get what they call a public safety statement from your officers. In other words, hey, what direction did you shoot in? What did you see? Do we still have outstanding suspects? Things like that that are important to the public. But because this is a homicide case, remember, they have rights just like anybody else
They don't
would.
have to say anything.
So we have to be careful. We have to get the pertinent information, which is the public safety statement, to make sure we're protecting the public, and then preserve their rights as well in these types of investigations. So it's not always really clear about exactly what you can and can't do, what happened, and those types of things. So as a law enforcement administrator, I've got to preserve all of those things.
Correct.
It's important for all sides of the fence here. And in that case, we had to do some crime scene investigation and a few other things. We ultimately called DOJ, and now that package has been given to them, and it's up to them to make the determination and use constitutional standards like you and I are talking about.
Gotcha. I'm so glad you brought up the fact that this girl was a victim. You know, it sucks. It's tragic because her dad is the one that put her in this situation. But a lot of times, you know, the media causes us to vilify law enforcement, and people forget that law enforcement was called for a reason. It wasn't like law enforcement showed up that day just to find some random 15-year-old girl and take her life. And, you know, that family that lost her is going to be affected. They lost the girl, they lost her mom, and then they're also, it's not just the family, but it's the deputies. They have to live with that. And I think a lot of times people forget that deputies and police officers have to live with the fact that they had to make a critical decision to preserve life, their life, and the lives of the community around them. But it doesn't make the situations or the decisions that they make, it doesn't make it easy for them to make those decisions, which kind of takes me to the next case that I want to talk about, which is Ryan Gaynor. When the Ryan Gaynor situation, well, actually, let me go back and kind of just give our audience a little bit of debrief on the Ryan Gaynor, at least as I perceived it. And I want to talk about the way I perceived it versus the way what's real, because the way I perceived it, again, even though I do a lot of research, I only really know what's out there or what gets out there. I don't necessarily know the inner workings. But as was my understanding, Ryan Gaynor was an autistic young man who his family called police department because they were having some issues with him in a disturbance in the home. The police get called out. They say Ryan is, pretty much having an episode. He has a weapon or some type of weapon in the house. He's been damaging property inside the house. So they called the deputies there to respond. As the deputies respond on scene, the moment, I think we timed it. The amount of time that deputy had to perceive whether or not Ryan was a threat or not a threat was less than 2 seconds. I think it was less than 2 seconds. Because Ryan comes out charging at the deputy with some object in his hand. And the first time I looked at it, it looked like an axe. And that deputy had to make a split-second decision, and he elected to utilize deadly force. So Ryan Gaynor loses his life. But what made this, I think, so charging was the fact that Ryan was 16 years old, he's autistic, and he's black.
Right.
And the deputies that killed him, I believe to be white, but not black, at least, at the very least.
Right.
So I think that's what kind of sparked an outrage in the media. So is my perception of how this evolved correct, and in what pieces to the puzzle am I missing?
Sure. So Ryan was 15, and just for the audience, so this is something that we're going to be involved in a civil suit. I know there's an attorney, but I will talk about what our response was. I certainly released the body-worn camera footage and talk about it. So we're talking about timing of the events. Almost immediately when the first deputy goes on scene, according to their body-worn camera, he announces into the house, hey, where is he? And when they announce that, Ryan presents himself with what's equivalent to a hula hoe and a frying pan and comes immediately to the deputy. So when we talk seconds, it's almost an immediate threat. Not 2 seconds, nothing, it's immediate. The span of time before the shooting occurs is approximately 6 to 7 seconds, with the deputy running away as Ryan presents himself.
Okay.
So that's kind of the time frame when you talk about critical decisions.
Correct.
And we were talking about constitutional standards and those types of things. That's exactly what the response was.
Okay, so in that, the deputies do what they do. They handle the situation. And again, for anybody watching this, it is tragic that Ryan lost his life.
Absolutely.
If as a dad, anytime, every video I make, I always say, any life that is lost is tragic. Any life that is lost. It's just tragic because they're related. We're all family. Everybody is related to somebody in some way. So it's tragic. So I don't want to be dismissive of that. But the deputies go there and they have to make a split-second decision. So talk to me about what happens after this. You're the sheriff, you get a phone call. Talk to me about the media response. Was it accurate? And then you also mentioned earlier, I was taking notes, you said you guys have something in place for the Sheriff's Department called the Information Exchange Group. So talk to me about how the Information Exchange Group played into your response to this Ryan Gaynor situation.
Sure. So Ryan, it's an investment in your community, and this is something our department's done for years. We call it information exchange, but it's members of the community, whether it's pastors from churches, the ACLU, a number of our community groups are members of Information Exchange, and they represent all walks of life, whether you're talking about the color of skin, preference, you name it. They come and they have access to not only me, but the entire executive staff. Whether we have law enforcement actions we've taken that they have questions about, or what our policies are. And then we also give an update, hey, what's happening in the community? What are crime trends and that type of thing? We do that, and we do that meeting with the community members about 2 times a year, both in the springtime and about the fall.
Okay.
So what also happens is, out of those groups, I have key members of certain communities that when we have an event like this, and you mentioned it, just in the media alone, is this going to be of interest to the media? You have a 15-year-old African-American juvenile who has mental health problems, or in this case, autism, a neurological disorder.
Okay.
And they're shot during a use of force incident or an officer-involved shooting. So yes, that's certainly going to get my attention as an administrator, and it's something I know I've got to get in front of with the community.
Okay.
So what I do initially when that happens, even when I have just preliminary information, I call some key members of the community, and I talk to them and I say, hey, this is preliminary. This is the information I've got. If you start hearing from the community members, please tell them that you heard from me, and this is what I know at this point. Then, as the investigation evolves, of course, you take care of the immediate issues and needs for medical and all of those things for the suspect. But you got to remember, this is going to be something that's going to be with the media. It's going to last for probably a week or more, and so really kind of making sure that we have all those responses. So what I did is, after talking to those key community members, because here's the thing: as the sheriff, I owe the community.
Yeah.
I don't owe everybody in the world.
They elect you.
They elected me.
Correct.
They need to know and believe that how we're policing them is just and constitutional, and the things they expect from their sheriff.
Correct.
So I go directly to the community. We called that meeting. I showed the body-worn camera video footage, and I talked to them about that. And then I listened to how they feel. And some people are going to understand why we had to do it. It's certainly, when you see it on the video, it explains a lot just in and of itself about how much time and what the deputies saw and what the deputies did. Explains a lot, but then I get a chance to talk to the community about things you and I are talking about now. Constitutionally, when can you use force? What is their training? Mental health training. Nowadays, a police officer receives a significant amount of mental health training. We received 70 hours total, and then we do even more crisis intervention training and ongoing training and trying to recognize these things. But I think in this case, it also brings in a very real way to the public that law enforcement officers get called to violence. And even though we have crisis intervention training and all these other things, you have to take care of the violence first. Whatever,
correct.
If somebody has a weapon, you've got to take care of what the public safety issue is for your own safety.
Correct.
There's nothing that police officers have to be beaten or anything like that. We have the right to protect ourselves. And same thing, we're there to protect the public. So you've got to take care of the safety issue first, and then now we can kick in the crisis intervention training, get services to them. And unfortunately, in Ryan Gaynor's case, we had done that 4 other times before this call.
Tell me more about that.
Well, Ryan had been introduced into the mental health system many times by us, going out there, doing an evaluation, and taking him to mental health facilities. And as a result of that, he obviously was released from those mental health facilities. And I think in the case of autism, I know many autistic parents, frankly, they take a beating from their children because they know if they call police are going to step in and protect them. And as a result of knowing that response, they don't call. And then they'll wait till Monday morning at 9 o'clock when there is services available for them and take their child to that. The problem is I think we need more capacity in our communities so that parents like Ryan's experiencing that crisis can have a place to take their child, because law enforcement's always going to have to deal with the public safety issue first.
And by the way, there's a lot of police officers and deputies who have kids with autism.
Absolutely.
And I don't want to brush over that, because that's a huge thing. A lot of times, you look at the Ryan Gaynor case, for instance, people thought they made it a black and white issue. And if you ask me, it wasn't a black and white issue. It was, you have to deal with a violent encounter. And when I did an evaluation on this video, the day before, I posted a video of an officer that was killed in New Mexico. And it was probably or arguably the hardest police officer involved shooting, or actually it wasn't an officer involved shooting, the hardest critical incident I've ever watched where an officer died the line of duty death. The officer shows up, he goes to contact on a suspicious subject call, he goes to contact this guy, they're about from you and I, distance from you and I, the officer's just like, hey, what's going on? And the guy comes out with the knife and literally is on top of that officer immediately and literally cuts him multiple times, and you can hear the officer choking on his own blood as he dies. Hardest video ever. People actually criticized me of why I actually played the video, but the reason I showed it was because I think I need people to understand that there are real dangers. And these are the things that are going through officers and deputies' minds when they're responding to calls for service. So fast forward to the Ryan Gaynor, less than 6 seconds. Less than 2 actually to make the decision, but less than 6 seconds from start to finish for that deputy to determine what was in the hands. And then this is what I found bothersome about the whole situation. You released a video, and for this to be sensitive to the family, you said, hey, look, I don't want to show the actual part of Ryan being killed by the deputies just because, you know, we still have to be sensitive to people that are going to watch this. So you do that. But the media takes it and spins it a different way, and they say that the deputies didn't render aid. And they say that they just kind of pretty much left them there. But that was quite the opposite. Am I correct in saying that?
Sure. So you brought up a couple of key things. And one was this did turn out to be a race issue, really, when it's not. This is a mental health capacity issue. There's no reason Ryan Gaynor should be dead if we have the capacity both for the parents to take Ryan to, or in my opinion, if we would have been able to off-ramp him in the social safety net about why all these things exist.
Okay.
So that's one thing. And I think that is the core root. If Ryan's life is going to mean anything and to make sure that we fix these things, we've got to make sure the social safety net is robust to be able to do that. And so that's one thing that I champion for, and I know we'll probably talk about other things
for sure
related to that. So when we talk about it, yes, one of the decisions I made was just to release the body-worn camera video up to just before Ryan was shot, because I truly believe that no parent should see their child get shot. The problem is that somewhere along the line there was a claim made that we didn't provide Ryan with medical attention afterwards. And I knew differently because I had seen the body-worn camera through. So as a result of that, there was a lot of social tension created by this that, you know, that you envision just in your own mind's eye that somebody's laying on the ground bleeding and not being helped. So what happened was we actually saw a number of groups mobilizing. I was afraid there were going to be protests and things, and it was important for me to get out to the public. Remember, I'd already given it to my community, right?
Correct.
Get it out to the rest of the public to say, hey, wait a minute, no, he was treated. So that's why we ended up doing a press conference and released the entire video, was to stop that narrative.
Now, does the narrative get stopped, or do you still have the people mobilizing to, you know, say, hey, look, this is still wrong on every front?
Well, what stopped about it is obviously the facts are out there, so the reasonable people are going to take a look at the facts and determine whether or not they believe that what we did was just or unjust, of course, from their own perspective. There are going to be groups that still, no matter what, this is what they stand for, and they're going to go out there. And as a result of that, we knew that there was a group, Black Lives Matter specifically, out of Los Angeles, that there was some chatter online about mobilizing. And as a result of that and putting out the rest of the video, we didn't see that. What we did see is the family do a press conference later on.
You talk about robust systems within behavioral health. And after this Ryan Gaynor situation happened, I had a really, really good friend of mine. She has a son with autism. And matter of fact, her brother is one of my partners and one of my best friends, quite frankly. She reached out to me and she was like very disturbed. Her son is Black. And her biggest fear is that, you know, what happens if they have to call police? Because the last thing she wants to see happen is what happened in that scenario. And I began to explain to her kind of how we handle it. You know, how we go out to these locations several times. Parents can be proactive and reach out to sheriff's departments and let them know, like, hey, this is my son. Take a look out at the layout of my home and stuff like that. So you kind of get to know them before you have to have a situation like this. But I want you to explain more, like, what are the programs that are in place now but what are the difficulties with trying to, prevent other crises from occurring like this in the future?
Sure. Well, even in a case like Ryan's, when you've been there multiple times, that was one of the criticisms. Well, you've been there multiple times, you know what to expect. Well, had the same deputies been there?
No.
And no matter what, even if it were the same deputies, you still have to answer the call. You
Correct.
still have to go in. And if you look at the body-worn camera footage, glass is broken. You still have to do a welfare check on those people that called you to make sure they're alive and well. And so I think not everybody takes that into consideration. And in many cases, we can't just walk away, from these situations. There has to be an outcome. Are people injured? Is somebody else in our best case scenario, we want to try to take care of Ryan, get him to the help that he needs, and at the same time, maybe there's medical attention that the family members need and that kind of stuff. So from a law enforcement officer's perspective, it's the totality of all the circumstances that go in there. If it was something that, hey, we could just walk away from. One of the things that you hear in this, and we also released the 911 footage, is unfortunately, and this goes back to the mental health capacity. And one thing I want your viewers to know, this isn't that our Department of Behavioral Health has bad hearts or anything along those lines. I think they're doing the best they can do in terms of resources. But I think cases like this emphasize what their needs are, and 24-hour calls. And in some cases, yeah, you may have it. Are they going to respond? Are they not going to respond? San Bernardino County is 20,000 square miles. So imagine
biggest county in the nation, I believe,
what the poor Department of Behavioral Health has to cover in terms of land mass. What if we're talking about a crisis? We talked about this one in Apple Valley in our deserts, which is a significant drive from a lot of resources down here all the way out to Needles. We cover a lot of ground to Barstow. So there's a lot of considerations that are coming here. And I think in this case, really highlighting this concept I call the social safety net is very, very important. So whether you're talking like in your case, city councils, how did they develop resources in the city for crisis centers and those types of things? I think if we're able to share that, just like I try to share it with our board members, then they can kind of wrap their heads around what we're seeing in the street. Because the reality is most of those assets that you and I are talking about, whether it's Department of Behavioral Health, public health, they aren't out when we're out at 2 a.m. It's just us.
So currently there is no, they don't operate 24 hours.
We can call them on a call-out basis.
Okay.
We can call them, but you're not going to call them for an active situation, particularly with somebody armed. What you're going to call them is maybe for the transport after the fact to enter them into the system. And I'll give you an example. From April of the previous year to this April, we've had almost 5,000 crisis calls. And I know the Department of Behavioral Health has helped us, but think 5,000 calls, and I think we've responded 48 times. And it's not that they're not doing their job. Sometimes it's us calling them and those types of things. But when you compare the volume of the calls we get,
5,000, and they've
lot.
responded 48 times.
Yeah, so it's a lot. It's a lot for them to handle. And I know we're working together and trying to build some of these capacities. But a lot of it is also, can you take somebody that's experienced crisis in your family and take them to a place? And we've got crisis centers, but I know the minute that most of them opened, the beds were full.
Yeah.
So exactly, the family's just going to get turned away again. So how do we do it? You and I can go on a Friday night to Arrowhead Medical Center where we take people that are experiencing mental health crisis. How many cars do you see on a Friday night? I bet you there's no less than 10.
Oh yeah, and that's the thing, is I have experience working in this county, and then I had experience working with our quality of life unit, which dealt specifically with people that were going through mental health, and we worked with the social workers and stuff like that. And what was mind-blowing to me is what the community didn't know. Like how many times we go out there, how many times we're contacting people, and how many crises are actually happening versus the amount of times that we're actually getting assistance. And it's sad because I think there's so much room for improvement within the system, but everybody points to law enforcement, which it actually takes me to this other idea that's been thrown out is, well, how come you don't just have social workers respond to a situation like Ryan Gaynor? But you brought it up earlier. You say, well, you have to stop the violence first. And I can't tell you how many times I've made posts where social workers will come out and say, look, there's no way I'm going to an active crisis where I know a person is violent and going to deal with that before I actually get them help. So can you speak a little bit more to that? Because again, we've heard it a lot, especially since 2020, is Why don't they have social workers go to these calls as opposed to law enforcement? Because law enforcement wants to go and just kill people.
Sure, because there's a perception, and we probably get it from just the media we ingest and the entertainment media
Yes,
mostly, right?
correct.
That you can say a magic word and all of a sudden the person's going to drop gun.
Everything and go away.
Or we can shoot somebody in the leg, during
Yes.
an active, running gun battle and things like that. They just aren't realistic. So for anybody that hasn't shot a firearm, they don't understand those things. And you're bringing up things that are a reality. Most medical professionals will not go out there or be able or even have the training to be able to deal with those highly violent, rapidly evolving crisis type of incidents. And let's think about it. Let's say we did hire them and we had a PhD that it's capable of doing all those things, and the costs that would be involved for the amount of time you'd be using them. But you brought up something earlier, and it's the frequency of these calls. If we were going to kind of put this into context, I know in our department we answer over 1 million calls a year. Less than 0.1% ends in any type of violence.
Let's say that one more time for me, please, so that our audience hears that again.
Less than 0.1% out of over 1 million calls for service that our department answers, and this goes nationwide, and obviously every agency varies on the number of calls they answer, but less than 0.1% ends in violence. And so you don't really see a lot of officers, and what's happening in those cases? De-escalation, all these things that the public never hears about. They only hear about the things when we do end up having to use force.
So you're saying ending in violence, not just ending in a shooting, but just ending with any type of physical
violence.
hand.
Yeah, even having to lay your hands on somebody short of, hey, turn around, put your hands behind your back, and not having a non-violent encounter. It's a very small percentage.
If you ask me, and I'm not trying to get political here, but if you ask me, that's a pretty good batting average.
It's a great batting average.
A phenomenal batting average. And I don't know any other professions that can say they have a track record with the amount of times that we are actually doing what we're supposed to be doing, the amount of times we get called out, and with the frequency of what we do. But like you just mentioned, is the perception is that we only see the white officer shooting the black guy or whatever it may be, and that's what we run with. Talk to me about SB 43 and what that is.
So SB 43, when we're talking about the world of mental health, it was a Senate bill that was passed, and what it did is, when we talk about somebody that's experiencing a mental health crisis, basically it's a very simple standard for law enforcement officers is, does the person have the ability to care for themselves or others? In other words, can they feed themselves? Can they protect themselves or protect other people? So when you look at somebody that's incapable of doing that because of a mental health reason or a substance abuse reason, just a number of things, we have the ability in terms of mental health to be able to take somebody and go to the hospital like we described earlier and get in line and try to get these folks treatment. But Senate Bill 43 was expanded that gravely disabled definition that we're all trained to apply to these Welfare and Institutions Code 5150 cases. They expanded it to severe addiction. So now for the drug abuse crisis we're seeing, fentanyl and a number of things that we see in the streets, we'll be able to apply that definition to some of these individuals and be able to take them into custody, not to book them in jail, but take them into custody, put them into the hospital, and now it'd be required to get them before the court and to do things, basically sentencing them, if you will, to drug rehab.
Wow.
And it's a powerful tool. The problem with the tool and what we see, and this is where I think the citizens don't understand what's going on. I know you and I would see the benefit in that because we can now make change. We
Correct.
don't have to leave somebody there rotting in their own skin. We can actually take them and get them help. But the way the bill was passed, and it's for these capacity reasons we're talking about, it didn't have to be implemented by the county for 2 years. So as a law enforcement officer and as the sheriff, and I'm fortunate that I am elected, so I have a pretty loud voice, what it ends up is being a wrangling based on capacity, based on what we see we need in the streets. Where do we land this thing so we can get that tool sooner than later? Because most of the people I talk to in the public, when they're homeless, they're drug addicted, they don't want to be accosted by them. And if we're talking about the human condition, which is
Correct.
what matters here, we're not. It was probably more humane in the old days to take them to jail. At
Correct.
least they got dried up and they got some help. So without those tools, Senate Bill 43 kind of brought that tool back, but in a different way to introduce these people to hospitals. So right now, working with the county and doing this arm wrestling and wrangling, we're not implementing in 2 years, and I had to fight pretty hard just to get it implemented in 1 year. Now, you would think most people in the public, wait a minute, we want this right now.
Tonight, like I want it today.
We want the person on the corner
Yeah,
at my
correct.
coffee shop to be able to be taken to the hospital. And I think in terms of the folks, the administrators of the Department of Behavioral Health and other folks, they're again, just very wary about the capacity. I think for them, hiring a cop right now is hard. Hiring a clinician for them is hard. So it's really balancing all of those needs and trying to take good care of the public. It was certainly my hope that we could implement right away and then work with the capacity issues and maybe target the worst of the worst. And like you guys, you mentioned your outreach teams. You know, I've had the HOPE team for 10 years
Yes.
now, and they reach out, and they are really my window into homelessness and a number of things. And I have numbers and other things that people have a difficult time producing and really what the causes are behind them. And like you know, we experience a lot of people that don't want help. That was a tool where we now can take them outside of, well, you want to refuse, you're not allowed to refuse anymore.
Yeah, we have that. It to me, when I hear that, it's common sense. It's what the community wants. It's what they've been asking for. And you go back to the human side of it. It's what we deserve as humans. Because before, the way I always did it was, you know, if somebody's under the influence, you know, if they didn't want to go with the program, took them to jail, county jail, let them sober up. It was a problem solver. The problem with that approach is that you would see that person in a few hours. And then when you start talking about Prop 47 and all these other things, the officers weren't even taking people in because it was just overcrowding systems and so forth and so on. So this SB 43, to me, it sounds like a great middle ground area because it's saying, hey, look, like, okay, we're not going to criminalize you for being under the influence, but what we're going to do is we're going to try to help you with your addictions.
Absolutely. It's kind of replacing the old drug court, but a completely different kind of dynamic.
But yet it's mind blowing to me that we don't implement this today. So I really appreciate you meeting with me on these topics because there's so much valuable insights that you're giving that people don't always get the inside scoop. All they have to go off of is people like me on social media channels delivering information. And the hope is that, you know, people are giving accurate information, but the sad reality is people are more into it for clicks. I watched a video of, I think it was San Bernardino County recently. Somebody was filming an interaction. It looked like there was a barricaded person inside of a car and everybody's out there filming and doing this stuff. And your deputies, I want to say it was your SWAT team or one of your special assignment units, they take him into custody and everybody starts cheering. Like, oh, look, nobody died today. Like, fine. And one of the guy that was recording says, finally. But when I saw that, it just threw me for a loop because I'm like, this happens all the time.
Absolutely.
It happens all the time. But yet we act like it never happens. So as a sheriff, what keeps you going? Because I can only imagine the buck stops with you when it comes to a lot of these decision-making processes. And it's a hard thing. It almost feels like you're fighting an uphill battle because right now, on top of all these other mental health issues that we're dealing with, one of the number one problems in law enforcement that people don't realize is recruiting and retention.
Absolutely.
So if you don't have recruiting and retention in place, if you don't have people staying in law enforcement, if you can't recruit the next generation of officers, imagine how much more the community suffers. So what keeps you going? Because, I mean, I want to know. I mean, that's a tough thing. You guys are in a tough place in law enforcement, and my hat is off to you guys because you, despite what the community says, you put your boots on, you put your uniform on every day, you still go fight the good fight.
Yeah. Well, I think you kind of answered the question, and that is the community. I think we live in San Bernardino County. You mentioned Riverside County. Our citizens are what I call a law and order body of folks that expect that, hey, we need to be taken care of. That's what we hire you for. So I always want to make sure I'm speaking their voice. But when you talk about recruitment and retention, if you're going to retain anybody now, those law enforcement officers that work for me need to know that I do have their back. And they also need to know, and the community needs to know, that when we make a mistake, I also own it. So it's having a foot in both camps and getting out in front of those things and making sure people understand, just like the conversations you and I are having today, there is much more intricacy and sophistication to many of these incidents that seemingly just happen very quickly on a video. And that's just not the case. And so we've got to keep it real in terms of explaining what law enforcement officers face. We have got to support them. And the media needs to start turning the page and not vilifying what's going on and have the greater understanding. That may get the clicks, it may do a number of things, and I'm sure they're worried about advertising or whatever it is that they're specifically in line for, but the reality is that isn't the correct picture of what law enforcement does. And trying to get the community behind us, because we are making those decisions that they as a civilized community don't want to make, we're their fists. We are their handcuffs. We deal with those difficult situations, and we're more than willing to do so. And what keeps me going is every one of those academy graduations, when I see young people of all walks of life willing to go up and take that oath to take care of us, then I know that as my hair continues to fall out and continues to get gray, that we'll be well taken care of. And right now, my point in time is to be able to stand for this community and stand for those deputy sheriffs and let them know we're doing all of the right things in a difficult time. And more importantly than anything else, I truly believe that as a profession, we are the stability in the world right now. People are looking for stability. In the United States, I would probably be fairly accurate in saying we seem to be very divided.
100%.
And almost a 50-50 split.
100%.
And I think anybody, no matter what politically, you want to talk about racism and colors, red and blue is the biggest racist problem we got going on.
Correct.
And there's a whole lot of us that are trying to be reasonable, raise families at a time that it's difficult. And I think that's the conversation that needs to be had. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican. Are you voting for things that are happening in your district, not aligning with a political party? And listen, we all know politics. That's got to happen every now and then, but it doesn't happen every time. There are important issues. You mentioned Prop 47. I think in the last decade of policing, whatever the outcome is this year, based on the voters, and there's a couple of initiative presents, will be one of those things in a decade that I certainly hope changes, because I see the things that I think we all see. Homelessness is increased, drug abuse is increased, and as much as many people in political parties want to say that's not the cause, let's use data, right?
Yeah,
when
please.
I talk social safety net,
Let's do it.
Let's use data. Our point in time count's continuing to rise. Let's look from the inception of Prop 47, and everybody forgets this part. So Prop 47, everybody wants to talk about retail theft and what they see on the news, right? But remember, drugs are also a part of this.
Correct.
And we've seen our point in time count go up. Well, part of Prop 47 and the money that the state saved from not booking people into jail goes to faith-based and community-based groups that were supposed to fill in the gap of what? Mental health and homelessness.
But yet
right?
we're dealing with that.
But are our point in time counts still going up? Yes. If you talk to the Hope team, we got about 2,000 people in this county that really don't want help, and the majority of those 2,000 are suffering from comorbidity of both issues, substance abuse as well as mental health disorder. So the reality is the policies in the state, have they affected it? It's my belief, because again, law enforcement's 100%. In the street, that yes, it has. And so going back to the human condition, I think we can make better decisions. And sometimes, you follow the money in these things and try to figure out exactly what's going on. And for us that really care about the public that we serve, we could care less about that. We want to have a place to take people. We want to see them get help. We certainly don't want to arrest them again. And I think you and I can easily say, have you ever met a law enforcement officer that got in this because they wanted to shoot somebody?
I haven't.
Not a one.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it, the impacts that it has on an officer. You could go after the most vile felon, and I promise you, it will affect that person for the rest of their life. Even if it was anybody that said, hey, I wouldn't even give that guy a time of day. We really don't matter what happens to them. No, it will affect the officer that was involved in that shooting or whatever the violent incident was for their entire life. So now imagine these things like these young people. We mentioned Ryan Gaynor. Some of the deputies involved in that had children too. When they close their eyes, they replay those events over with their children and those types of things. And I don't really think they understand the impact. Even as the sheriff, you talked about the thing that happened, a year ago with Savannah Graziano. When you talk about incidents like that, one of the things I see as the sheriff is I see my deputies' faces. And I know they never wanted to shoot that kid or anybody else.
Yeah.
I know where their hearts lie. And I know that they're out there for all the right reasons. And I will stand behind them always, and when rocks get thrown, I'll stand in front of them, because they deserve that for what they do for us as a community, and that's all law enforcement officers across this nation.
Well, I appreciate that. I know the men and women that work for you appreciate that. I've seen law enforcement leaders cave because of politics. And what we need is strong leaders. And I've known you since before you're the sheriff, and you've always believed in me. One of the last things I want to talk about before we wrap this episode up, because I think it's phenomenal. You have those people on the other side of the coin that say, well, what do you do to handle the bad ones? And I've always said this, but 99.9% of law enforcement officers, good-hearted, good intention. But you do have those people that slip through the cracks that shouldn't have had a badge or that have gone sideways in the badge. And it's happened. It's happened for the sheriff's department. It's happened in my department. You see it. But a lot of times those things don't garner headlines, you know. And so a lot of times what happens is the media just feels like, or the community feels like, oh, well, it doesn't happen. You guys don't hold your own accountable. So what measures are in place to hold the community or to hold law enforcement accountable? And what have you guys seen, or what have you guys done throughout the years in order to make sure that you guys have the best men and women that are patrolling the streets of your community?
Sure. I think the public needs to understand, and this is one of the things we do. You try to explain it, but it's kind of hard. And it's really that peace officer bill of rights. So the public's understand, hey, I saw that on video. It looks terrible, right?
Yeah.
Well, number one, we've got to protect everybody's rights. You and I kind of touched on that, both the officers and the suspects involved in the case. So that's one of the things that we have to take into consideration. So the immediacy of these things happening aren't always as clear cut as that. So preserving that. But the other thing is I don't think people understand that a law enforcement officer, and I'm talking about an admin investigation, not a criminal. So we're stepping into the HR world now, right?
Yes.
That we order a law enforcement officer to talk. That means we are violating your rights, and if you don't talk, I'm firing you.
Wow.
I do not think the public understands that law enforcement officers are put into that position under these admin investigations. So yes, we read them their rights, and at the same time, I am now ordering you to talk. And if they refuse to talk, it's considered insubordination and they're fired. Where do you have a profession anywhere that's held to that standard?
Correct.
And then you're going to talk to police chiefs and you're going to talk to administrators like me. One of the things that Senate Bill 2 about decertification of police, you'll find we all agree with. We did have an issue where a law enforcement officer, you could start an investigation. There were probably somebody that most of us would agree we didn't want them working for us. And before the investigation was finished, they went to another department. And you can't always share that information with a prospective employer. With Senate Bill 2 and involving the peace officer standards and training, the certifying body that certifies all of us when we graduate the academy, by involving them, it prevents that bouncing around from happening. So when we do identify somebody that shouldn't be amongst those ranks, they can't get into the profession. So there are some things, even with all the reform things that are going on, that are certainly good. It's trying to be able to have that reasonable conversation about what's good, what's not good, and how do we ultimately as a society get to where we need to be and still realize that there need to be men and women that are standing the line and protecting us from evil.
Man, this has been such a great interview. Everything you just touched on, and it's funny as you talk about it, I've experienced. I've been involved in officer-involved shooting. I had the same rights read to me that I've read to suspects that I've taken to jail, and I've been ordered to talk before, and it was the worst experience ever. And the person in my officer-involved shooting wasn't killed. I didn't kill them, but even still, I still felt the pressure. I still struggled. Through the investigation, not being able to talk to anybody. And so you imagine, you add on the fact of what if you kill somebody? What if, like, you know, the fact that you do have somebody that ended up dead in the scenario, it messes with you. And so I think a lot of people don't really understand that a lot of the things that the community is asking for is already in place and in very good ways. I'm not gonna say that we're perfect, because we're not perfect. And another thing is that California law enforcement isn't an embodiment of Florida law enforcement, Texas law enforcement. Even though we all don badges and have police and all have guns, we also operate differently. And the sad thing is that, you know, if somebody does something on the other side of the country that looks bad, we all basically get criticized for it. And that's why I want people to, like, use deductive reasoning and use view every individual crisis in and of itself. Don't compare it to your preconceived notions, because I did that and I fell victim into thinking that the law enforcement was a corrupt system, is systematic, and so forth and so on. But when you view it through an isolated lens, it clears everything up. So is there anything else, Sheriff, that you want to highlight today, or things that you're working on, things that you want the community to know before we wrap this up? I mean, you have literally shed so much light for me. I commend you. And like I said at the very beginning of this, like, this is not a political episode at all. This is friend to friend. I consider you a friend. You've, like I said, supported me from day one. Is there anything else that, you know, we didn't touch on today that the public needs to know from a sake of transparency, or just like, hey, this is the what, the why, and how we do what we do?
Yeah, I think where we could really use the public's help, and you and I talked about Prop 47, for instance, but that's just one example. There are a number of things that really come to us on the ballot, and Prop 47 came into place. We called it the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act, if we all remember that.
I remember
going back
that.
10 years
it had
ago.
nothing. It said nothing about drugs.
It had nothing to do with that. So as a voting body, we could certainly use the public's help into making sure that, that we understand exactly what we're placing on the ballot, and we hold those accountable that are allowed to put that type of message out on a ballot that really is disingenuous.
If you ask me, it's unethical.
It is. In my opinion, it's unethical too. And I think when we come into this year's ballot, I think things will be spelled out a little clearer. I think it's incumbent upon the chiefs of police and the sheriffs really across this state to make sure that we're doing our part publicly, to talk to our public. If you're concerned about public safety, this is how we see the world. And it doesn't matter at the end of the day how anybody votes. It's whether or not we're making the effort to educate people so they can feel confident in what they're voting for is the best thing that they feel for themselves and their neighbors. And that's really where I'm at, and I know that that's what the cops do day in and day out. I'm still very proud to be involved in this profession, and even though California makes it difficult at times, we are built for this. And it doesn't matter whether you're a deputy sheriff or a police officer across this county and across this state. I know they're doing and serving the public's will, and I couldn't be more proud to sitting in the seat that I'm sitting in right now.
Well, Sheriff, you've done a phenomenal job. It's just awesome to know that I live in San Bernardino County, I work in San Bernardino County, and I know you guys have such amazing partners within the community, and it is a good fight. But like you said, we're built different, man. Law enforcement officers, we're built different. We're called for this profession. I truly believe it's a calling because not everybody can do it. But with the right support like you, the leadership, people like Greg that help facilitate this, have done a phenomenal job. So thank you so much for coming on this show. And thank you guys all for tuning in to this episode of the Ryan Tillman Show. My goal is to just bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Like from the day I started my work in 2014 to today, it has not changed. My goal is to have transparency, dialogue with one another. So if you know anybody else that you want me to interview, shoot them my way. Let me know. I'll interview them. And do me a favor, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It helps support us so we can spread this message across the globe. Thanks again, and God bless, and we'll see you guys on the next one.